Well, it's Flint, Michigan all over again in Jackson, Mississippi, where nearly 200,000 residents are being told to just shower with their mouths closed. And that's for those fortunate enough to still have running water at all. But many homes can't even wash their hands, flush their toilets, or put out fires for an indefinite amount of time. And schools have gone entirely virtual now as their access to water has been shut off. Meanwhile, the heat index has reached 102 degrees with no accessible way to cook, clean, bathe, or hydrate, and people are buying plastic bottled water in bulk. So how did this happen in a major capital city in the US? How does this fit into the greater story of water? And how can we prevent this kind of thing from happening in the countless other cities with equally archaic and crumbling water infrastructure? Stay tuned because we're going to explore all of that today. Did you know that in many places in the US, the plumbing infrastructure was actually installed during the Lincoln administration? And in Jackson, Mississippi, some of their water mains are over 100 years old. This is a view of your average tap water pipe in the US. Appetizing, isn't it? And I promise there is hope, and we will get to that. But first, let's take a hard look at the cause of this situation, which is, frankly, an inevitability of water privatization under late-stage capitalism. The fact is, this is just a preview of what's to come. So we have to understand how it comes about. Because around the country, towns are poised on a similar precipice. In all, Reuters has found nearly 3,000 areas with recently recorded lead poisoning rates, at least double those in Flint during the peak of their contamination crisis. And more than 1,100 of these had rates of elevated blood tests at least 4 times higher than Flint. The poisoned places stretch from Warren, Pennsylvania, where 36% of children tested had high lead levels, to a zip code on Goat Island, Texas, where a quarter of tests showed poisoning. In some pockets of Baltimore, Cleveland, and Philadelphia, where lead poisoning has spanned generations, the rate of elevated tests over the last decade was 40 to 50%. And just this week, toxic levels of arsenic were found in New York City tap water. Pipes are crumbling, and they're degrading everywhere. So the question is, who determines which communities receive funding for infrastructural repairs? You can see Jackson is just one of many points on a larger iceberg, and this crisis has been decades in the making. Although this case in Mississippi involves many aspects of racial politics that we won't cover here today, the overarching problem with water treatment is the same throughout the US. Amendments to the Clean Water Act during the Reagan era drastically reduced federal aid to municipalities for water and sewage infrastructure, and federal support in the form of EPA grants virtually disappeared around that time. And they were replaced instead with access to state revolving loan funds, money that would have been useless to a town like Jackson that just didn't have the revenue to pay them back given the consistent population decline. So with decreased federal funding of public infrastructure and no access to the state revolving loan funds, water costs were offloaded to consumers. But this is more than many inner-city families can shoulder, and many have been evicted over their inability to afford the simple substance that should be a basic human right. You cannot trade or sell a human right or deny it to someone on the basis of the inability to pay. The right to water is inherent to human dignity. But currently 1 in 10 Americans can't afford their water bill, and prices are consistently higher in lower income areas where people may spend up to 12% of their total income on water. Please let that grim fact sink in for a minute, because we will continue to see those numbers rise unless we radically shift away from seeing the source of life as a source of profit. By 2017, federal spending on water utilities had collapsed to less than 4% of the total, which is the lowest percentage of any infrastructural category, like highways or aviation or transit. So why is the elixir that gives us life and health and longevity prioritized lower than literally anything else? Because blue gold is more valuable than black gold, especially when it's scarce. That's the nature of supply and demand. The demand for water is universal. Folks in the US demand between 80 to 100 gallons a day just to live per person. So when clean water supply is low, prices can skyrocket, and people can take something free from nature and profit wildly from it. Water is a big business for private corporations. This also means that when the source of life is commodified as a source of profit, only those who can afford it have the right to live healthy lives. And those who can't afford to pay have the right to contract waterborne diseases or dehydration-based illnesses, or to spend the majority of their livelihoods just trying to pay for this liquid life. Taxpayers currently give the Pentagon nearly $2 billion a day. And the US has officially sent over $55 billion to the Ukraine this year alone, although, of course, many speculate they're laundering many times that amount through this proxy war. And they consistently send about $4 billion a year to Israel. But for their own citizens, buy bottled water. Let them eat cake. This is why water, more than anything else, must be deprivatized. But, Isabel, isn't tap water a public utility run by local governments? Well, you would think so. But as with most government programs nowadays, water has been outsourced to for-profit businesses. Public municipal tap water utilities, which are owned by the government, are almost always subcontracted to private corporations to treat, repair, and maintain them. This trend started back in the Reagan era and has had massive ramifications ever since then. Water privatization is a huge money-making business, and many places in the US have completely sold their entire water supply outright to international companies, which now own the community's very bloodstream. As a commodified product, water is traded and sold and price hiked and profit gouged and resold multiple times between the source and the tap. Even in cases where the originating lake is only miles from the suburb that's receiving the treated lake water, it could already have been bought and sold numerous times in between. In Jackson, Mississippi, their water is run by an international company called Siemens, who now has to pay $90 million to make up for the damages that they allowed, which won't even begin to cover the $2 billion bill for repairing infrastructural damage, much less personal and medical costs incurred by citizens. According to an international investigative report by the Forum for Environment and Development, water privatization has failed to deliver water to the poor, undermined the human right to water, taken place at the expense of democratic principles, and with minimal accountability to local citizens, and it has led to a foreign control of water and the creation of giant monopolies. There has been bribery, corruption, non-compliance with contractual agreements, layoffs, tariff increases, and environmental pollution in every case of privatization where water is put in the hands of for-profit companies. And I hate to say it, but it's true. A fascist system of government-sponsored corporate interests celebrates when something like this happens in Jackson, Mississippi, because the dirtier the world's waterways become, the more valuable their private clean water assets are. These transnational water cartels, like Siemens in Jackson, don't want to see a world of clean water. The more scarce it is, the more they sell their water treatment and management services or their private clean water assets. Few people are even aware of the downstream effects of exploiting water this badly, but Jackson is a perfect example. These international water monopolies are some of the most powerful criminals in the world. The most dangerous cartel ever isn't smuggling guns or drugs, it's privatizing water. Remember, when water is inside of us, we call it blood, and when it's outside of us, we call it water. But regardless, it's the same liquid life force. And when these powerful corporations control our own external bloodstream, it inevitably results in suffering, as the people in Jackson are painfully discovering right now. So, can life be owned? Well, no, of course not. Life is the vivacity under the will of God alone, but if the sustenance of life is owned, then the lives of all who require it are controlled as well. In fact, the Chinese symbol for water is also the symbol for control. So what can we do about all of this? Well, the first shift that needs to take place is restoring water from a commodity to a commons. So what's a commons? It means that water is owned by everyone, including the earth itself, as part of a public trust rather than as private property. Cross-culturally, since the beginning of humanity, water has historically belonged to nature while being under community control. Throughout the world, complex water conservation and water sharing systems ensured sustainability and accessibility to all. Indigenous communities have developed peacekeeping water sharing agreements that crossed tribal and cultural borders and endured for hundreds of thousands of years. Community control meant that water was managed locally and as a common resource. And such community-based systems can still be found in the Andes and Mexico and Africa and Asia. And yet in just a couple hundred years of privatization under colonial capitalism, water scarcity and inequity has become the greatest threat facing our species. For innumerable reasons that I won't go into here for the sake of brevity, market-based solutions simply don't work when it comes to water. Comment below if you want another post just about that. But here are some solutions that do work. And stay tuned to see which of these could be implemented in your community, and let them inspire you for how you can get involved in Jackson as well. So one really great alternative to the corporate control of water resources is PUPs, or public-public water partnerships. And this is where established public systems share expertise and skills to those in need, like public sector unions using their resources to support public water services in developing countries to provide local workers with skills. It's been working really well between Stockholm, Helsinki Water and authorities in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and between Amsterdam Water and cities in Indonesia and Egypt. If each effective public water utility in the wealthier nations adopted 3 cities in need, PUPs could operate globally and provide water to everyone in need at a fraction of the cost of what's now spent by supporting private companies. And this is just one concrete example of how cooperation over water could be a globally uniting force for humanity, joining people of diverse cultures to share and prosper together. Another great role model is in Uruguay. So their water had been privatized by a subsidiary of Suez, one of the most evil water cartel companies in the world. And as it usually happens when these transnational water hoarders take over, water prices skyrocketed. The water they provided was polluted, and services were cut off to schools and underprivileged areas. Exactly the same thing that we're currently seeing happening with water under the control of Siemens Corporation in Jackson, Mississippi. So the Uruguayans rallied for the reform of their constitution, and they passed a constitutional amendment that actually established the right to water and forbade privatization. So that's a model that water activists have as a precedent when advocating for global change: democratic constitutional reform. Because democracy is not just an electoral ritual, it's the power of the people to shape their destiny and determine how their own thirst is quenched. Next, and maybe the most exciting step forward, is that we can see this tragedy as an invitation to build back better. Currently, Jackson is without water access indefinitely because they don't have the $2 billion necessary to make repairs, and this is heartbreaking. But when they do receive investment, and I trust that they will, the infrastructure they install should honor water's right to life and to health, if the people themselves who drink from it hope to have life and health as well. We all know that we can't solve a problem with the same mentality that created it, right? And all this archaic water infrastructure was created with the mentality that water is inanimate and can be forced into labor like an object and exploited as a commodity. And as a result, they're suffering scarcity. When water is forced into slavery, it rebels and ultimately dissipates. Because when water loses its vitality, its molecular coherence, its conductivity, its aeration, etc., then it allows sedimentation to build up in pipes. It creates an anaerobic environment where bacteria and pathogens can flourish, which require chemical treatments, which further gunk up the pipes and the pumps, and then they add lubricants and greases to the pumps that leach into the water in order to maintain the pumps. And all of these chemicals require pH balancers, and then the water stagnates in reservoirs, requiring even more intervention. All of these mechanistic, objectifying ways of treating water create an aggressive solvent that breaks down the metals from the pipes. And all in all, it's just an incredibly inefficient and very expensive system that's doomed to eventually destroy itself. Just using ferroelectric metals alone is harmful to water, not to mention the toxic movement patterns that they create. Water systems have been designed to move water in unnatural, linear ways through the use of pressure turbines, pumps, straight and right-angled pipes, etc. But moving water centrifugally in this way produces abnormally high reactive pressures and infra and ultra-red radiation. So when water is forced in just a straight path, it's continuously forced to give away energy, which depletes its electromagnetic charge forces and disconnects the hydrogen bonds from one another, creating disordered, chaotic molecules. And again, it just creates denatured, devitalized, tired, and often aggressive water. So when cities repair with some of the same kind of infrastructure, they're going to suffer the same kind of results in another 100 years. The crumbling of the old ways allows us an opportunity to implement innovations in biomimicry-based plumbing that can supply water that is fresh and living and vibrant by mimicking the way that water moves in nature. When we mimic nature's movement patterns, water can gradually come to attain what's referred to as its latent energy state, wherein it has plenty of inner energy resources to draw from. Now, this concept was illustrated by Victor Schauberger in Stuttgart, Germany in 1952, that water flowing through a straight pipe experiences more resistance than water flowing through a spiral enclosure. And that resistance means that the city has to use more electricity, pumps, treatments, and resources just to get it from point A to point B. But water flowing through a spiral enclosure experiences less resistance as the velocity is increased, and at certain velocities, the resistance actually drops below zero. A negative resistance means that the water is actually generating energy from its own momentum. It's building its life force vitality. And if they were to use these principles according to Schauberger's innovations, there could be no need for dirty electricity in the city. The water flow itself would generate energy. And you could actually harvest energy passively. If a whole city used spiral pipes and had the right passive energy receptors, the plumbing alone could ostensibly power the city's entire electrical grid. Now that is an exciting prospect. But beyond just the pipes that need an overhaul, the holding tanks will also need to be shifted to express this new paradigm of respecting and working in cooperation with water's life force. In these cases, they could use one of my favorite examples of the power of spiral fluid dynamics in action. It's called the Lilly impeller. So just imagine, for only 200 watts of power, for the same amount of energy it takes to light up a light bulb, in less than 6 inches, this tiny little spiral moving 800 million pounds of water. This famously effective vortex design came from an inventor named J. Harman. And these are used effectively in hundreds of water holding tanks around the world, where stagnant water usually stratifies over time, causing layers of different temperatures and different microbial strata, etc., which just pose problems for the uniform treatment of the entire tank of water. Even the largest municipal cisterns could be mixed efficiently, even with just a small Lilly impeller and barely any electricity, due to the perfect proportions of natural spiral geometries. And because the water isn't stagnating, the water managers are using 85% less disinfecting chemicals in these cases. At just 6 inches by 4 inches, it replaces the need for an entire 25-foot turbine. And finally, here are some things that we as individuals can do to help in cities like Jackson, or even right in your own community, to address the water crisis. The more scarce water becomes, the more we will all need to learn these ways that we can each honor, respect, and preserve water. It's not something that is solely up to legislators. It is up to communities. So don't wait for water protection to be enshrined by law or practiced by corporations before you sovereignly take steps to protect and preserve water. Set the example in your own community in a local way for how to steward your shared bloodstream. Find and revive your local springs. Springs are invaluable, and they are the source of life, and they have been preserved for countless generations of our ancestors as important places left to us as a legacy so that we can drink and live and be free. But in recent generations, not only have we completely devalued them, allowing many to dry up without stewardship, but most people don't even know where to find them or how to harvest from them. It's crucial to restore this relationship with springs and divest our reliance on corporate or government water supplies. Water comes from the earth, and this is a communion that must be safeguarded. Tend to your watershed. Bring water back to the landscape. The natural hydrological cycle is sufficient to clean water when it's flowing naturally. You can bring back the rains using tools like cloudbusters and rain seeding. You can dig water retention ponds. And check out the amazing resources from Water Stories for how to turn even dry, arid deserts into lush green landscapes by making them an inviting home for water to stay. I highly recommend their courses. And in places like Jackson, permaculture-based urban water planning can go a long way in preventing the damage that was caused by their recent flood and in providing organic tap water treatment so that the city's effluents can be cleaned by natural rather than chemical methods, such as in Stockholm, where we see an example of sewage treatment plants that are actually in public parks right beside where people walk and play and picnic, because they use natural biological systems, microorganisms, and flowing vortexing movement patterns to break down the organic matter that remains after the solid, non-biodegradable materials are removed. And that's all done in a sustainable and odorless way. Even cities are an important part of a watershed. Ultimately, we just have to start living within the limits of our own watershed. This is the most important step that we can take to survive as a species. Hauling, piping, and bottling water from other areas to deliver to dry or polluted regions simply worsens the core problem. Instead, we need to focus on ways that we can entice water to seep into the earth in our own region, not how we can purchase water that's been stolen from another region. This is water sovereignty. This is creating a partnership with water right where we stand. I highly recommend the book Watershed Discipleship for those who are truly interested in taking on this ecological stewardship as both a practical and a spiritual path. And of course, my final recommendation is to invest in a high-quality water filter. If you're not able to find a nearby spring to steward and harvest from, get a filter. Sadly, effective filtration can be really expensive, and it's not accessible to most of the people who are most affected by water crises like the one in Jackson. But the fact that their tap water was eroding continuously for decades, and they'd been under boil advisories many, many times leading up to this final failure, it's a good reminder to not trust tap liquid. For those fortunate enough to afford filtration, please do so. Either buy a filter or your body becomes a filter. You can find my top curated list of recommendations along with discounts at waterislife.shop, with my personal favorite being the Spring Aqua Wet 7. Now finally, I just want to say that we in the West have so far largely been able to escape the effects of water scarcity longer than those who have already been facing the crisis for decades, but we will all face it eventually. And Jackson, Mississippi is a perfect example of the encroaching karma of colonizing water resources. This cannot be ignored. It's time for reparations. For decades now, there has been a water apartheid between the water-rich global north and the water-poor global south. Around the world, the wealthy drink bottled water from the few remaining uncontaminated parts of the world, or water that's increasingly sucked from clouds by corporate-controlled AWG machines, or desalinated for profit by machines that pollute the ocean even as they steal water from it, while the poor die in increasing numbers from lack of access to these luxuries. The water crisis is highlighting class disparity in America and abroad in shocking ways that are antithetical to the decentralized and generous nature of water itself. According to the WHO, 80% of disease worldwide is caused by unclean drinking water. 80%. And currently 1 out of every 3 people on the planet doesn't have access to potable water. Please let that sink in for a minute. Because by the year 2050, it's estimated that 1 in 2 people will be without clean water, half of the world population. This isn't science fiction. This is what happens when we stop treating water with respect. This is what happens when we apply the laws of supply and demand to profit from what nature has freely and abundantly bestowed. The only solution to the inevitable effects of water colonization and privatization is to decolonize our relationship to water. To learn more about how to decolonize your relationship to water, if you want to get involved on this path, check out the webinar Allying with Water at waterislife.teachable.com. I really hope that what has happened in Jackson and Flint and elsewhere has caught your attention, because no matter where you live, you are a body of water. No matter how disconnected you feel from those places, they nevertheless affect you. So let this be both a warning and an invitation. Many other major societies in history have perished by their destructive water practices. Water mismanagement is the most common cause of the downfall of empires throughout history. The Akkadian Empire of Syria, the Old Kingdom Empire of Egypt, the Mycenaean culture of the Late Bronze Age, the Mayan civilization, the Tang Dynasty of China, the Anasazi culture of the Southwest, the Khmer Empire of Angkor Wat, the Ming Dynasty. All of these collapsed because they mismanaged their water supplies and caused drought and pollution through them. This civilization now is on the verge of doing the same. Since the Industrial Revolution, all value has become synonymous with commercial value, and spiritual, ecological, and social values have lost their significance. It's time to revive those, and to remember that water is more valuable than money. Life is more valuable than money. Scarcity is not nature-given. It's a product of a culture's relationship to water. Cultures that waste their water or destroy the fragile web of the water cycle create scarcity and pollution even under conditions of abundance, whereas those that save every drop can create abundance out of scarcity. Water can either be your medicine or your poison. Water carries the very power of your life and your death. Do you really want that power in the greedy and criminal hands of centralized corporations? So this is our task. This is what water is desperately asking of us. Nothing less than reclaiming water as a commons for the earth and all people, to be wisely and sustainably shared and managed, to reject the basic tenets of market-based globalization. The current imperatives of competition, unlimited growth, and private ownership when it comes to water must be replaced by new imperatives, those of cooperation, sustainability, and public stewardship. Water is the thread that connects us all. And every violation of the water cycle is an act of war and violence against life itself. Humanity's treatment of water has put us at war with life. Enough. We can do better. And because cooperation and self-governance are the key to managing water, partnering with water can inherently create conditions of peace. So water must be understood to be a part of the global commons, but clearly subject to local, democratic, and public management. And it's up to we, the people, to restore the blood of the earth back in every single watershed, back into the trust and stewardship of those local communities. Let Jackson be a call to action. Let's build back better and let water lead the way. If you feel called to get involved and you want clear step-by-step guidance in learning how to make a bigger impact, how to activate your water guardianship and empower your aqua activism, grab my water guardianship workbook that has fun, interactive ways to really get started with water activism and stewardship. You can find it at waterislife.teachable.com. And for a way to immediately help the folks in Jackson, you can donate directly to families in need through GoFundMe. Just go search for Jackson Water Crisis and you'll find multiple opportunities to get money directly into the hands of those in need without third-party nonprofit middlemen. Please take the time to do that. And if you liked this, please comment, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Be well and stay hydrated.